In this video, we'll go over 10 tech cards which absolutely no one uses that actually have some pretty good effects. And when I say nobody uses it, I mean they do sometimes see competitive play, but just not a lot or not recently. And at number 10, we have Ghost Mourner and Moonlit Chill. This card has the effect that allows you to negate the effect of a monster in the field after it's been special summoned, and also if that face-up card leaves the field this turn, the controller takes damage equal to its attack. So basically, it's like Effect Veiler or an Infinite Impermanence, except it also deals a little bit of burn damage, and has the stats of the Ghost Sisters, where it's a level 3 tutor, so it has some niche uses with Christian Halki Fibrax. And the reason this card doesn't see very much play is because it's a slightly more restrictive to use Infinite Impermanence or Effect Veiler, and also has a hard once per turn, which the previous two cards lack. So if all you need is a hand trap that negates your opponent's card effects, usually you're set with just Effect Veiler or Infinite Impermanence, as they can target any effect monster while not having once per turns on their effects. Which means if you have 3 copies of Infinite Impermanence in your hand, you can use all 3 copies of them in hand during your opponent's turn. But if you have 3 copies of Ghost Mourner and Moonlit Chill, you'll only be able to use a single copy. So the effect is actually pretty good, as most people will use Infinite Impermanence on a monster of a special summon from the extra deck anyway. And if your opponent continues their combos in order to get rid of the card in the field, they'll take extra damage. So it's a perfectly viable tech option, even if it's not as live as the other two, and absolutely does see competitive play occasionally. And at number 9, we have Gizmek Kaku, the Supreme Shining Sky Stag. This card has the effect in the hand where if there's a monster in the extra monster zone, you can special summon this card from your hand, and it has another effect where it can absorb a monster in the extra monster zone, and if it destroys a monster by battle, you can special summon a monster that's currently being absorbed by the card. It is a pretty decent stat line at 2750, so with most decks ending with a monster in their extra monster zone, this card is almost always live, and it has a really good for removal and a chance to just special summon the card it removes. This card kind of reminds me of Dino Wrestler Pankratops in its usefulness, except the effect is purely limited to monsters in the extra monster zone, which is most likely only going to be a single target. But its effect is not spell speed 2, so it can't avoid disruption like Pankratops can. So, because it can't just choose anything your opponent controls, it's limited enough where it doesn't see widespread play, but has a technically really good effect, which is also pretty generic. And at number 8, we have Mistaken Arrest. This is a quick play spell card which has the effect where cards cannot be added from either player's main deck to the hand, except by drawing them, until the end of your next turn after this card resolves. So since it's a quick play spell card, you can actually chain it in response to your opponent activating something that searches from the deck, like Elemental Hero Stratos for example. Then it will stop the card from searching, and stop them from searching for the rest of the turn, which sadly does carry over to your turn as well. It makes it so you can't do any searching when your turn rolls around. So Mistaken Arrest is basically a longer lasting version of Drone Lockbird, except it has the benefits where it's able to stop a search from happening in the first place, rather than stopping searches from happening after a search has already been performed, which is how Drone Lockbird activates. Although Drone Lockbird has the advantage where it's a hand trap, so you can use it during your opponent's first turn, whereas Mistaken Arrest can't. Although if you're going first, or if you just really don't want to play any monster cards in your deck at all, Mistaken Arrest is a perfectly fine alternative to Drone Lockbird, assuming you're fine being locked out of searching during your turn as well, which some decks can accommodate. And at number 7, we have Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries. This card has the effect where if your opponent controls more monsters than you do, you can discard this card from your hand in order to reveal one monster in your extra deck, to then banish all copies of that card from your opponent's extra deck with the same name. So if you just stack your extra deck with a whole bunch of very common boss monsters, you can completely stop your opponent's end goal, where they have to use their second best cards, or just lose in some cases if you banish the card their entire deck revolves around, like ABC Dragon Buster. And this card absolutely did see some competitive play. It just hasn't seen very much competitive play recently, because most meta decks go into a wide variety of boss monsters, not really a specific one. And because this card kind of falls into the category of just not being played right now, it's somewhat low on this list, kind of like all the other ones I've talked about so far. And at number 6, we have Shared Ride. This card has the effect where after you use it, each time your opponent adds a card from their deck or graveyard to their hand except by drawing, you get to draw 1 card. So it's kind of like a spell card version of Maxi, except one that only triggers on searches rather than special summons. And generally, most decks special summon a lot more than they search, but copious amounts of searching is kind of a requirement of a deck being a meta deck, and since you can just chain it in response to your opponent already performing any search, you'll always go at least card neutral with it, even if you only draw a single card. It seems like all the cards that have Sangan in their artwork, like this one in Mistaken Arrest, kind of just have effects that are similar to popular hand traps, while being slightly weaker than them. And the fact that they're quick play spell cards inherently nerfs them compared to their hand trap counterparts. In addition to just not being as strong as their hand trap counterparts, as generally, the reason hand traps are really good is because you can use them during your opponent's first turn. That way you can stop your opponent from establishing an unbeatable board rather than trying to react to it. And at number 5, we have Royal Decree. This card has the effect that where it's faced up on the field, it straight up negates the effects of all other trap effects on the field. So it's a trap card that stops all other trap cards and is basically the trap card version of YuGiOh, the card that has seen competitive play ever since it came out in 2002. And it's pretty obvious why. It's one card that shuts down a third of the cards in the game. However, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, actual trap cards aren't really played very much. And the best way to stop trap cards is usually to just use Red Reboot. Red Reboot can negate the effects of trap cards for only a single turn. However, it's spell speed 3 and can be activated from the hand. And that hand trap status means you don't need to set it like Royal Decree for a turn in order to flip it face up on your next turn in order to gain the benefits of locking out your opponent's trap cards. Plus, Royal Decree has counterplay to it, where your opponent can stop it with just any form of removal. Red Reboot is much harder to stop though, because of that spell speed 3 nature, and you don't need to wait a turn in order to make sure the card is live. In fact, Red Reboot is so good at stopping trap cards that it's currently limited on the ban list, whereas Royal Decree is completely unlimited at 3 copies. And Royal Decree does have a long history of competitive play in the side deck as a tech option, which shouldn't surprise you based on what this list is about. In fact, the card was even semi-limited for 4 formats back in 2007 through 2008, and then one more time in 2010. Although it's definitely in the category of fallen out of favor recently, mainly because trap cards on a whole aren't as widely played, and it requires just a tiny bit too much setup, where actually it's kind of better to just use a Denko Sekka instead, for example. And at number 4, we have Retaliating C. This card has the effect where, if your opponent activates a spell card that has an effect which can special summon a monster, you can then special summon this card from your hand. And it has an additional effect where, if it's special summoned by its first effect, it gains a floodgate effect where any card sent to the graveyard is banished instead. So a hand trap version of Macrocosmos. In addition to this card's effect on the field, where if it's sent from the field to the graveyard, you get to add an insect type monster from your deck to your hand, just as long as it's earth and has 1500 or less attack. Now, its floodgate effect is actually kind of limiting in how it can actually be applied, because not a lot of decks use spell cards to special summon pretty heavily. Although there are some archetypes which almost exclusively special summon through spell cards, and those are generally fusion archetypes, where pretty much all fusion spell cards are spell cards. So it's an excellent option to use against a fusion heavy deck. In addition to its floating effect not being once per turn, doesn't miss timing and activates no matter how it's sent from the field to the graveyard. Since Maxi is currently banned, there isn't a super good generic card you can search out, but I do use this card a lot in Duel Links specifically because of that effect in order to search out Resonance Insect, which is another insect type monster which does not have a once per turn on any of its floating effects that can search or send cards to the graveyard. If they ever create a really strong insect type archetype in the future, you can bet they're going to be using Resonant Insects and Retaliating C to some advantage. And at number 3, we have Witch's Strike. This is a trap card which can only be activated if your opponent negates the activation or effect of a card, or if they negate the normal or special summon of a monster. In which case you get to destroy all cards your opponent controls and in their hand. And since the name of the game in modern Yu-Gi-Oh is to negate, it seems like this card would always be live and provide you amazing advantage because it just destroys your opponent's entire hand. And that is 100% correct. The card is potentially incredibly good. However, it's a trap card, which requires you to set it first and wait for your opponent to negate an effect before it gets destroyed on your side of the field. If the effect was simply a quick play spell card or a hand trap, it would be kinda broken. The way they rein in the power level of this card is by attaching it to a trap card, which slows it down just enough that it's just a really neat tech option, but doesn't see very much competitive play. Because if you're able to resolve the card a single time, the amount of advantage it nets you can kind of win you the game. However, your opponent can just negate the effect of Witch's Strike in order to stop that from happening, which is kind of ironic considering the activation requirement of the card. And at number 2, we have the Engraver of the Mark. This is a card which has the effect where, if your opponent activates an effect which requires them to declare exactly one card name, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard in order to declare another name, which then becomes the name they declared for that card's effect. and it also has an effect on the field where it can destroy one of your opponent's monsters after a turn. Now, this card falls under the category of having an incredibly niche counter effect, but it's potentially pretty good. There have been some cards in the meta which required you to declare exactly one card name, and I have seen competitive play, like Mind Crush or Prohibition. Although those cards haven't really seen competitive play recently, and they were never really widespread enough where it was worth running a card like Engraver the Mark in order to circumvent their effects. So unless Konami puts out a new, really strong card which declares exactly one card name, it's probably going to stay a niche card that no one uses, but has the potential to be very useful. And at number 1, we have Sales Pitch. This card can only be activated if your opponent adds a card from their deck to their hand except by drawing, in which case you get to add any card from your deck to your hand, although you can't activate the card for the rest of the turn. So, Sales Pitch basically just lets you search out any card in the game without any restrictions, and that's almost useful to literally every deck. There isn't really a deck that doesn't benefit from being able to search out any card. And the activation requirement is the same as Mistaken Arrest or Shared Ride, i.e. your opponent just adding cards from their deck to their hand outside of drawing, which means you're pretty much going to have the card live in any normal duel. So why does nobody use Sales Pitch if its effect is obviously super good? Well, the same reason as Witch's Strike or Royal Decree, because it's a trap card that needs to be set for a turn first. And that's pretty much it. I bet there will be some decks which can make use of it in the future because the effect is just really good and it's not that hard at all to activate. It does have the restriction where you can't use the card you add to your hand during the turn, which definitely limits it a lot. If you could use the card, then you could use it to search out a hand trap during your opponent's turn in order to stop your opponent from doing whatever they're doing during their turn. Although since you can't, you're basically just limited to searching out a card that'd be really useful during your next turn. But being able to search out any card is still really good even under those restrictions, so it might see some competitive play in the future, who knows? And it's definitely one of the best tech cards that no one's currently using. Alright, and that's the list. There are a lot of tech cards in the game that nobody uses, and also some of the cards in this list do see competitive play, just rarely. So if you have any cards that you think would have been much better on a spot on this list, or have ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.